Dang, I spent too much time talking about white Mormon Jesus and I didn't get to talk about what I wanted to talk about today, which is becoming the special in your own story, a la Lego Movie. When I was growing up, I was actively taught regularly that I was so lucky and so blessed to be born as a white American Mormon because we were the chosen ones of the last days who were going to usher in the second coming. Of course, I had no idea that every generation before me had been told that same thing, but it still made me feel really good. And lest you think that that was just a grassroots, unconventional thing to be teaching Mormon kids in the 90s and early 2000s, on my mission, 2009 and 2010, I had regional authorities come to give special conferences to our mission. And one entire conference was about how we were the pure blood of Israel, and therefore we were racially superior to everyone else in the world, and that we had been chosen by God to be missionaries at this time to prepare the world for the second coming. And yeah, it's really messed up. But I felt the Spirit super strongly in that meeting. And that's one of the things that has told me that the Spirit, as we call it in the LDS Church, is not necessarily as reliable as we think it is. That and the fact that I feel the Spirit in like Captain America and like listening to Hamilton and stuff like that, that kind of garbles the message. Anyway, the point is to say that in the post-Mormon context, as we're going through a faith deconstruction, it's kind of disheartening to like lose our specialness as we're deconstructing, because part of it is recognizing that like, oh, white people aren't better than everybody else. Oh, Americans aren't better than everybody else. Oh, we're not better than anyone else for being Mormon either. In fact, in some ways we're worse. That's hard. It's disheartening. It sucks. We all want to be special. So this video is a reminder to you, wherever you are in deconstructing and reconstructing your specialness, to go and watch the Lego Movie and watch how Emmett, goes from being what he thinks is a normal person to being what he thinks is like cosmically chosen and special, to being discounted as not special at all, to realizing that he's creating his specialness in his story. And the really good news is that there's a mind-numbing amount of stuff that can be made better in our world right now, and you can jump into any of it. And as one of my favorite quotes says, it takes very little to be above average. You really don't have the high bar anymore. You can do even a little bit here and there and be special. Okay, the Spirit. It's super important to deconstruct these ideas around the Spirit as we're going through our faith journey. I think it's equally important to reconstruct ideas with the raw materials that we break apart from our ideas of the Spirit, because it turns out that the LDS concept of the Spirit actually covers a lot of stuff, and it can be applied pretty differently in different people's lives. For me, I thought of the Spirit as a very daily functional aspect of how I lived. As I listen to more Mormon stories and other experiences from other people who have left the church, I'm realizing that that's rather unusual, that a lot of people actually don't feel the Spirit or don't consider themselves as feeling the Spirit at all. I'm not trying to tell you that you have felt the Spirit or that you haven't. I'm just going to present how I have deconstructed my understanding of the Spirit and what I am trying to use from that deconstruction to reconstruct my new paradigm. For me, the Spirit took kind of 5 basic shapes, and they were these. Number 1, it could be the pull of a charismatic leader, such as like my mission prep teacher, my MTC teacher, my mission president. These were all charismatic leaders in my life who had a certain, who had a pull of charisma, and I often associated that with the Spirit. 2, it could be catharsis in a story. So when you watch a movie, and for me, it's like really clear in something like a Marvel movie or a Disney movie or something like that, where you have this building action, a building tension between the characters that is resolved at the end. And as it's resolved, as that resolution happens in the story, we as the audience get what's called a catharsis, which is kind of this like emotional release of like, oh yay, everything's gonna be okay. And that can be associated with the Spirit too. Third is an emotional thrill or some kind of emotional experience, stimulation, etc. Fourth would be an intellectual thrill. And fifth would be, I don't have a great name for this, but the best name that I have so far is the inner knowing, as Glennon Doyle calls it, which I interpret as being like something from somewhere else that we can't explain, but we have internalized it really deeply. I think this also applies to like the deep peace that's often associated with the Spirit. And we don't necessarily know where that comes from or what causes it or how, this person knows to go and check on this other person at this certain time when that other person really needed it. We don't know how that thing happens. We don't know how that stuff happens. In the LDS context, we call it the Spirit though. All right, here we go with number 2, which is catharsis. The church has a strong history of using catharsis to mean the Spirit. I think the clearest example of this is during the middle of the 20th century when the decisions were made to mythologize the story of Joseph Smith and to change the narrative, to correlate the narrative and make it consistent so that everyone was telling the same story about how Joseph Smith, this poor, simple, uneducated farm boy, just grew up, in a big family in New York, and he went out in the woods because he had an honest question, and then he had this transcendent visionary experience where God himself visited him, and Jesus Christ, they both visited him, and then they told him that he was going to restore the church, and Joseph Smith went home, told his parents he was just persecuted, and then he found the plates and he translated them into the Book of Mormon, and it changed the world. It's a really cathartic story to tell, even with the tragedy at the end. And in fact, the tragedy just kind of makes it more poignant. The fact that Joseph Smith is like killed for doing the right thing. Nobody was told that he was actually killed for revealing the Masonic symbols and for practicing polygamy with other men's wives, and because he had tried to murder Governor Boggs and a bunch of other things. But that's what I mean, is that once you learn more about the actual history of Joseph Smith, all of a sudden that catharsis disappears. There's no more catharsis in the story of Joseph Smith once you know that he was maybe on psychedelics in the woods and making up plates and telling people that they were going to die if they looked under the sheet where he had a tin can. Okay, sorry, that was an oversimplification. It wasn't a tin can. They were just tin plates. But anyway, the point is that catharsis has often been conflated with the Spirit. Or maybe the Spirit has been conflated with catharsis, and that it's important to understand the mechanics of catharsis if you want to deconstruct the Spirit in your post-Mormon context. I think we can probably sandwich one more into this video, and that's number 3, which is emotional thrill. This is kind of connected to catharsis because catharsis is primarily an emotional experience or an emotional reaction to a story. And an emotional thrill can come by the same means, and it has the same problem as catharsis too, which is that it can be manufactured in settings and environments that are quite alien to the church's purposes. Doesn't stop the church from trying to use it though as the Spirit. So emotional thrills can come through things like gratitude, through feeling affirmed from listening to other people's testimonies, from feeling excitement or anticipation for something coming up like girls camp or EFY. It could come through unity and connection, a feeling like when you're serving with a bunch of other people. Could come as a feeling of love and support when someone is serving you. To me, the important thing to remember here is that all of these reactions are normal, but that they've been relabeled as the Spirit. Number 4, in ways of understanding the LDS idea of the Spirit, is intellectual thrill. And I think this one also has a strong history in the church. So I think that the church has really co-opted a bunch of strong experiences to all mean the Spirit, and this is one of them. Intellectual thrill can include things like discovering something new, connecting something familiar with something, like connecting two familiar ideas in a new way. It can mean like exploring mentally the fan fiction of something, the background stories of something, how things might have been connected. And it can include confirmation bias, or feeling affirmed because you found that key piece of Egyptian archaeology that just proves that at some point they worshipped one god, and thus the church is true. I think there are different ways to describe this, but when I imagine intellectual thrill, I'm seeing in my mind the scenes from The Beautiful Mind, where this brilliant logician, mathematician, is seeing patterns all over the place in newspapers, in books, in tabloids, in his bill statements. Like everywhere he looks, he's seeing patterns for things. And these things don't contain any patterns. That he was trained to be a code breaker during the Cold War to protect the nation, but it kind of drove him insane. That he was so brilliant that he just kept finding patterns everywhere, even where there weren't codes or conspiracies to crack. And I think especially for the highly intellectual members of the church, this can be a huge sinkhole of time, that you can just spend so much time trying to connect these disparate ideas, looking for different versions of chiasmus, sifting through like the Egyptian archaeology example, or Mesoamerican archaeology, or Incan theology, or anything. Like you can look through anything and only keep the examples that are affirming to you, which is called confirmation bias, of course. This thrill that comes from like searching out deep doctrine and connecting all of these different disciplines, of language and Egyptian archaeology and the Native American customs, etc., can be very thrilling. It can feel like you're really onto something. And I think Joseph Smith honestly liked that too. But that doesn't mean it's accurate. The key here, I think, between intellectual thrill that is inappropriately called the spirit and logic or rationality is that logic and rationality will try to account for all of the evidence. Okay, last one, number 5 of manifestations of the spirit from my LDS context was the inner knowing, or the spiritual peace, like the deep certainty, the deep peace that I couldn't explain. And this also included like knowing that something was going to happen. Premonitions in that way could include visions, or like the strong prompting that something needed to be done right then, or some person needed to be contacted, etc. Not everybody has these experiences, apparently, but that doesn't mean that they're fake, and that doesn't mean that nobody has them. And I can attest to that. I had them. I think personally, this is one of the most exciting places to undergo some reconstruction, because this is like the edge of what we know. Why do some people experience spiritual things like this, and others don't? Why do some people get prompted to call, X other person when that X other person really needed help, but they don't get prompted to call Y other person? Why do those things happen? And why? Just why? Like, it's such a fuzzy edge, and there's so little that we know about it. For my sanity in my deconstruction and reconstruction period, I've just concluded that these things are all part of the human experience, and that it's important for us to recognize the whole spectrum of things. And this applies to the other ways, the other manifestations of the spirit too. The emotional thrills, the intellectual thrills, the pull from charismatic leaders, the enjoyment of a catharsis. These are all normal, and these are all good parts of the human experience. Joseph Smith did not own these things. The spirit, the LDS spirit, doesn't own these things. And sorry, not sorry, general authorities, but you don't own the rules on these things either. I also enjoyed deconstructing my ideas about the spirit, because it allows me to humanize some of these early church leaders, including Joseph Smith, a lot too. That they were also dealing with this fuzzy edge of reality, and like, why do certain things happen? And Joseph Smith just happened to be exceptionally brazen and hubristic in coming up with explanations for these things and assuming that he could control them. As you're going forward with your reconstruction, like, use this as an exercise and try to identify the ways, like the manifestations of the Spirit in your life, and whether it's appropriate to keep accessing those parts of your experience as you move forward. There's no reason that you can't follow that inner knowing, with even if you don't call it the Spirit. I think really one of the best things about LDS doctrine is that it teaches you to listen to that inner knowing. But the worst thing is that it teaches you to listen to charismatic leaders first. Last thoughts about the Spirit and processing the Spirit when you're going through a Mormon faith crisis. It's really important to distinguish the different types of experience that you're having, that we're all lumped together under the umbrella term of the Spirit. Additionally, it's really important to distinguish what kinds of information you were receiving from those experiences now that you are disconnecting it from the Spirit. Because when those experiences were included under the umbrella term of the Spirit, we were taught as LDS members that means this is true. If you read the Book of Mormon and you feel good about any of those stories, that means it's true. If you hear a super racist talk that really affirms your own racial superiority, that means that that's true. That means you really are racially superior. If you hear a talk that's super homophobic and makes you feel affirmed in your own nuclear family and fearful of a gay family, then that means that the talk was true, that the homophobia is good. Obviously, that is not a good logical model, because you can feel good about a lot of things that aren't true, and you can also feel really bad about a lot of things that are true. However, that doesn't mean that those experiences are useless. That doesn't mean that those experiences are void of value. I'm kind of the opinion that every experience you have is giving you information, and that it's up to us to learn how to use that information well. So in those examples that I gave, when you read a Book of Mormon story and you feel good about it, what does that actually mean? What does that actually show you about yourself, about the way that you're thinking about the story, about the way that you're internalizing the story, about the way that that story affirms or confirms your previous assumptions or your current choices or whatever. And you could do the same thing with those other examples. That usually these experiences, these emotional experiences that have been lumped under the umbrella term of the Spirit, still have a lot to teach us about the ways that our minds work, about the ways that we process emotions, about the kinds of characters or figures that we're drawn to, that we admire, that we want to be like, about the things that we need to learn about, whatever. The key, though, is not to throw those experiences away. Just stop associating it in this simplistic paradigm as being like, oh, I feel good equals true. That's a faulty paradigm. It's not useful. But that doesn't mean that your emotions aren't useful. And that doesn't mean that your emotions, in whatever direction they go, don't have something to teach you. They all have something to teach you. All of the experiences that you have can have value if you know how to take those experiences and break them down in order to analyze them. All right, it's my last week on TikTok, so we better get to the heavy hitters. Temple, priesthood, bunch of weird crap in church history. Let's do it. So I found this graph on Reddit this morning. Temples, are like an increasingly big deal for members of the church. As you can see, by the way, RMN is flexing about it. You're probably at least partly familiar with the history of the Kirtland Temple, but if you need a little refresher, then here you go. It was announced in 1831, and this was at a key point in church history in which there was a lot of competing revelation going on, and Joseph Smith was having to burn and grind up Hiram Page's revelations and Hiram Page's seer stones, and he was having to say things like, no, there will never be a prophetess, and there's only one person at any given time to be like the prophet on the earth. This was all in this period. So we can tell that Joseph was struggling to consolidate his power and authority over the church, and so all kinds of things start emerging in this period, such as the two levels of priesthood, by the way. That's one of the reasons that a lot of the witnesses lost trust in or completely left the church was because Joseph introduced this totally new level of Melchizedek priesthood to be over the Aaronic priesthood when things started getting out of hand and people started contradicting his opinions. Anyway, back to 1831. I guess there were a lot of strong opinions among his highest up male leaders because he starts to send them out on missions starting in 1831. And he's also needing to give these saints some promise for all of the hardships that they're going through, some promise for their faithfulness. And it also works as kind of a gravitational point before missionaries go out on their missions, that they're promised to get this endowment of power before they leave on their missions. So construction starts in 1833. It costs about $40,000 in the currency of the time, which would be about $1.3 million in today's money. So still kind of on the cheap side as far as temples go in the modern LDS Church. It was completed and then dedicated on March 27th of 1836 in a 7-hour service. There were multiple sessions that started with just the elders at the beginning. It was just the elders with Joseph in the upper rooms of the temple, and then it expanded out to the general public. And for these graduated meetings had some different features. And for more information on why I think the psychedelics theory for Joseph Smith is a very compelling argument, I will leave a link in the description below on the article called The Restoration and the Sacred Mushroom. Anyway, a lot of the language that we use around the temple was introduced here at the Kirtland Temple, but it developed later on in Nauvoo. So let's finish up talking about the Kirtland Temple. This isn't really the most interesting part of temples or the biggest thing that most people need to process, but I find that it is kind of like an important bracket on a lot of people's shelves because there were so many purported spiritual experiences at the Kirtland Temple that tends to be a real big bolster in people's testimonies, is that they assume, including myself, I'm really talking about myself here, that I assumed that even if there were all of these problems with the modern church, even if there were historical problems with the Book of Mormon, even if there were character flaws with Joseph Smith, but there was still this Pentecostal outpouring of the Spirit, and where did that come from? If God didn't approve of this, wouldn't that not have happened? Thoughts like that. Okay, so that's why this is part of the reason that the Sacred Mushroom article is important, because you start to see how psychedelic mushrooms could actually be infused in things like consecrated oil. And when you read the descriptions of the way that they were applying this consecrated oil, it wasn't just like, ooh, a dot on your head. This was like pouring it over their heads and then massaging it into the scalp. And of course the skin is very porous and it can go straight into the blood vessels, which takes it into the brain. Additionally, the visions and types of spiritual raptures that were being reported actually perfectly align with the types of symptoms or manifestations of visions that are usually associated with these psychedelics, including hallucinations, just nonsense hallucinations. Like one of the apostles was seeing chasing a ball around the room. It was super bizarre. And then there are visions of devils, feeling bound. And there are also visions of heavenly glory and serene peace. But anyway, okay, so Kirtland was a way of cementing this new frontiers people, diverse community together. And Joseph Smith, whether he got this idea from somewhere else or whether he came up with it himself, I don't know, but it is a very effective way of bringing a group of people and solidifying their experience together to require them to sacrifice something together. And so the Kirtland Temple, the building of the Kirtland Temple, really did that for this community of saints. And they had this common cause, this common purpose. They were looking forward to their endowment. And then when there were these spiritual raptures caused by who knows what, that was a really big solidifying part of their faith. And that's why even with the trials to come, they were willing to do that, because they did believe that Joseph Smith had some power to access divine intervention. But dang it, I didn't get to the Kirtland Safety Society, so we'll have to do that next time. Okay, so we've got this frontier church, super young, full of these opinionated people who are trying to have their own revelations with seer stones. And then we have Joseph Smith, this charismatic leader, possibly using psychedelics, incredibly interested in teenage girls like Nancy Miranda Johnson and Fanny Alger. And stuff starts to go to pot a little bit. They're also super in debt because of the building of this temple, and there's not very much cash to go around. So Joseph and Sydney come up with this super, super great idea, which is to make their own bank and to get people to invest in the bank, because that's the only way that a bank actually works, right? Is if it has money, is that they take these boxes of sand and then they put a layer of coins across the top, and they take the boxes around to the members of their community, of the LDS community, of this fresh fledgling LDS community, super trusting of their new prophet. And he says, in the name of the Lord, I promise you that you will get a return on your investment. Look at all of this money that we already have. And then people would invest their entire life's savings or whatever else they had to the Kirtland Safety Society. Well, then Joseph and Sydney start driving around in new carriages, buying new clothes and going on little trips and paying off the church's debts, while the rest of the saints in Kirtland are grinding up their pottery and their china and their heirloom, porcelain to make the stucco for the walls of the temple. Now that I come to think of it, this isn't so different from how the church uses the widow's mite today to give the general authorities big velvet chairs, new clothes, $150, $1,000 stipends, $1 million houses. I guess it's not that different. But like most Ponzi schemes, the Kirtland Anti-Banking Company, or Kirtland Safety Society, eventually collapsed under its own weight. And Warren Parrish, who was one of the scribes to Joseph Smith, and also an officer in the bank, said, "I have listened to him, Smith, with feelings of no ordinary kind when he declared that the audible voice of God instructed him to establish a anti-banking institution who, like Aaron's rod, shall swallow up all other banks, the Bank of Monroe excepted, and grow and flourish and spread from the rivers to the ends of the earth, and survive when all others should be laid in ruins." Whatever Joseph's other faults, he definitely did have a great flair for drama. So all of these factors combine with the Fanny Alger affair, again, in 1835, 36, 37, to the collapse of the banking company, and then Joseph and Sydney have to flee town. Eventually, the saints lose the temple to disaffected members like Warren Parrish, and Joseph convinces the saints to go to Missouri. In Missouri is where the temple plot thickens. The way I like to think of this actually parallels the way that Joseph handled his finances, because Joseph was horrible at finances, right? But he managed to keep this church afloat for a good 10 to 15 years. And the way that he did that was by taking out a loan, and then he would take out another loan to pay off that loan when he ran out of money. And when he ran out of money again, he would take out another loan to pay off that loan. And so he was always scrambling for money, always trying to get people to jump in on the consecrated order so that he could use their money, always trying to get poor saps like Martin Harris to donate their entire life savings to pay off his debts, etc. And I think he was doing essentially the same thing with these spiritual promises, that he would promise the saints these spiritual manifestations. And then when the bill came due, when the saints started saying so when is this going to happen? When are we going to be delivered? When is the spiritual outpouring going to come? Joseph would kind of scramble, figure out a way to make something happen, and then roll it forward into the future and say oh, Zion is actually somewhere else. Zion is going to happen here. Zion is going to happen when you're more faithful. Zion's going to happen when more people contribute all of their life savings, etc. Hopefully you've read through at least one or two, hopefully more like 3 or 4 biographies of Joseph Smith, just to kind of start getting an outline of what was happening in this period. But if I were to summarize it briefly, it's that in Kirtland, or in even New York, he's promising the New York saints that if they go to Kirtland, then they'll found Zion, then they'll build a temple, then they'll have the endowment of power. So they get to Kirtland, they build this temple, the outpourings come to the smaller groups, and then in the larger groups, not as much happens, but it's like still a good experience. People still love it. But there's not necessarily the same Pentecostal outpouring that there is in his smaller groups of gatherings with elders and the washing and anointing of the oils. So when things start to collapse in about 1838, we've already done the Kirtland Temple thing, and people start saying like, well, when is that deliverance going to happen? When's the second coming going to happen? When is all of this stuff going to happen? And Joseph has to scramble and think like, well, actually, it's going to happen in Missouri now. Ohio's not the chosen place anymore. Now it's Missouri. And so he promises that like everybody move to Missouri, and that's when we'll build the really big temple. That's when we're going to get like the endowment plus of power. That's when we're going to really establish the saints. That's when the second coming will really happen. And of course, if you know church history, you know that the same thing happened when they were expelled from Missouri, that Joseph started forecasting like, no, never mind. Missouri was just this practice thing. We weren't faithful enough. We didn't deserve it. So we were kicked out. But now we're going to do it in Nauvoo. And the same type of thing happens today. The version of the Elias settlement in Missouri that we learned in Sunday school, rich with a sauce of persecution complex, goes something like this. Poor Joseph and Sidney were so persecuted in Kirtland that they had to take the saints and go settle in Missouri instead. And those saints in Missouri were so peaceful and kind, and those Missourians were just nothing but mean. And they signed the extermination order, and then Emma had to cross this river like carrying 5 children and a whole bunch of papers so that they could publish the Doctrine and Covenants and survive. And then they all got malaria and they settled in Nauvoo, but they did it because they were brave and courageous and faithful and right, and it's the true church, the end. I don't want to detract, especially from the women who were involved in this movement, because they definitely were brave, courageous, determined, resilient, all of those things. They were freaking incredible. I think they were sucked into a Ponzi scheme, but I also don't think that's their fault. Anyway, the way that I think about Missouri's history with the saints now, including actual historical documents, and not just the propaganda that they give us in Sunday school, goes like this: that Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon fled Kirtland because they had committed bank fraud, and people were very angry at them. Disaffected members of the church who saw through their ruse took over the temple, and they kind of lost that area. For those members who were still under their control, Joseph managed to convince them to move to Jackson County, Missouri, where he started to expound upon his dramatic theology of how Jackson County was the Garden of Eden, and this is where they were going to build 24 interlocking temples and all kinds of other weird stuff. Nephitish altars. Zelph was found on the way to Missouri with Zion's Camp, and Zion's Camp is a whole nother issue. But we're talking about the temples, and the temples was a centerpiece of the Missouri vision of Zion. And so when Joseph was prophesying about the temples, it was a big deal. They needed to lay the cornerstones. They needed to plan to get those temples built. When things started to go south in Missouri, and this was primarily because of people like Sidney Rigdon giving very inflammatory speeches about how they were going to exterminate all of the Missourians, and then Lilburn W. Boggs issued the famous extermination order in response, quoting Sidney Rigdon, so that, that's kind of on him. But anyway, so as things started to go south, Joseph becomes increasingly desperate to hold on to Missouri because he's made all of these huge promises and prophecies about Jackson County, Missouri being essential in the last days, and they're going to build these temples, etc. And it's not happening. So Joseph starts to hedge his bets. First, by blaming the members for not being faithful enough, and that's why it's not working out. And second, by arranging or at least participating in the organization of the Danite Band, which administer the first version of the oaths and covenants that were later used in the temple. Eventually, Masonry would come into this too. In the end, Joseph went to Liberty Jail in order to save the lives of basically all the saints. I think David Patton was really a turning point in the Missouri War because that was the first life that had been lost. I think that Joseph, this is just, my interpretation of the events, I think that he was really getting caught up in the pageantry of war, that he enjoyed the grandstanding about it, but that once someone he actually knew had been killed by gunfire in Missouri, it really got real for him. And so when it came down to it, he made the right choice and he gave himself up to go to Liberty Jail in order to give the saints a little bit of time to get out of Missouri and out of the way of the angry Missourians. But that was a hard call because it meant admitting that his prophecies hadn't come true, that they hadn't built the temples, they hadn't gotten the land, they hadn't made friends, they hadn't converted the American Indians who were right next door. None of the things that he had prophesied came true. But even though the saints didn't actually finish building a temple in Missouri, that period of millenarianism with the temples and imagining this huge complex that was going to be Zion in Missouri, and the persecution complex mixed with the blame game from the leaders, mixed with the secret bands that were doing, violent shunning or just active aggression behind the scenes for the church, all have informed the ways that temples and church culture has developed since then. So now we're going to move on to Nauvoo. But before we go on to Nauvoo, I just want to give a plug to the only church that actually has built a temple in Independence, Missouri. So if that's an important last days prophecy for you, then maybe you should check out the Community of Christ, formerly the RLDS Church, because they actually fulfilled the prophecy, even though they don't necessarily think that Joseph Smith needed to be a prophet. You can think whatever you want about him in that church. And yet, they're the ones who actually fulfilled that vision. I think that's just delightful. In the Nauvoo period is where things start to heat up with Masonry and the LDS temple. But to understand this relationship, you also have to know more of Joseph Smith's context about Masonry. He grew up with his father being a Freemason, with Hiram being a Freemason. He was transcribing the Book of Mormon and all of these thoughts about the secret societies and the suspicions of how they were infiltrating government in the midst of the very anti-Masonic fever that was sweeping through America during Andrew Jackson's presidency. There was also a very famous murder of someone named William Morgan, who had revealed the Masonic symbols and was hunted down and murdered for it. That man's widow remarried, joined the church, and eventually became one of Joseph Smith's mistresses, which we now call his plural wife. And we'll go into more detail next. Oh my goodness, there's so much to talk about with Nauvoo, so I'm going to try and say this as fast as I can in a comprehensible way. In June 1839, Joseph escapes Liberty Jail. Nauvoo is having all kinds of problems. They're trying to drain a swamp. They're trying to battle off malaria. Everybody's sick. There's all of these interesting stories that come out of that are not the topic of this video. In September of 1840, we've talked about this in previous videos too, Joseph Sr. dies. He's the patriarch of the church. And I think he was one of the main anchors into trying to make this a truly Christian religion for Joseph Smith, because he wanted to fulfill those expectations for his father. In that same month of September of 1840, John C. Bennett comes to town, who's a known profligate. He's already abandoned a wife and at least 2 kids. He has some fake medical degrees. He seems to be an accomplished abortionist, and he rises immediately to Joseph's inner rings, to Joseph's inner confidences. He becomes the mayor of Nauvoo. He helps get them the charter. Joseph basically makes him a kind of a third wheel member of the first presidency. There technically are 3 members of the first presidency, but John C. Bennett wasn't officially called to that capacity. He just kind of functioned in that capacity. But key to me about John C. Bennett is that he was a big proponent of this spiritual wifery stuff, which was kind of in the air in America at this time. And he was an abortionist. So the fact that he rises so quickly in the ranks of Joseph Smith, and that only a few months after ingratiating himself with Joseph Smith starts taking on a lot more wives, is very indicative to me. Just a couple more dates, and then I'll tell you why I'm telling you all these dates. So the first real sealing that we have from Joseph Smith, the first theologically justified plural marriage that we get from Joseph Smith, is on April 5th, 1841. There were at least 2, possibly as many as 5 other affairs before this time, including the widowed Freemason's wife, Lucinda Morgan Harris, in Missouri. However, this is the first time that Joseph Smith calls it a sealing. He starts calling it a plural marriage. He starts justifying it theologically. That happens in April of 1841, about 7-8 months after John Bennett comes to town. Then in August of 1841, Don Carlos, Joseph's brother, dies. About 6 months after that, he marries Don Carlos's widow. So for those of you saying that he was just trying to preserve families, like why didn't he just seal Don Carlos's widow to Don Carlos? But then in September, Don Carlos Joseph's son dies. So there's a whole lot of trauma going on around here. And we'll get into how this connects to Masonry. Okay, now we're going to get into the Masonry dates. So you have the dates from the previous video are largely about Joseph's personal relationships, and they kind of highlight the trauma that was happening for him as he was losing his father, his brother, his sons, and also creating these new relationships with women on the side, many of whom were already married. And then he encounters John C. Bennett, who seems to have a way of conducting these types of relationships without ever being caught by something like pregnancy. So there are about 7 plural marriages before the Freemasons come to Nauvoo in March of 1842. They establish a lodge in Nauvoo, and 1,500 men are immediately inducted into the order. Joseph Smith rises extremely quickly through the ranks. In fact, according to the men who inducted him as a master mason, he made him a master mason on site. By March 15th, 1842, Joseph Smith is a master mason. On March 17th, 1842, Joseph Smith organizes the Relief Society in the upper room of the red brick store, the exact same room where he will be administering the endowment for the temple in May of 1842. The endowment for the temple was a direct copy of the Freemasonry, Masonic rituals, hand gestures, grips, etc., except that it was cloaked in the story of the Garden of Eden instead of the story of Hiram, an apprentice working on the Solomon Temple. I know that's a lot to take in, but let me try and connect some of the dots for you. The reason that all of this is important is that Joseph Smith was strategically choosing women based on either, it seems, their youth or their position in Emma's life or in the community. He would marry the midwife so that he could cover his tracks. He married daughters or members of all of the first presidency of the Relief Society, and he resisted letting Emma grow the Relief Society early on because he was saying it's growing too fast. He seemed to be wanting to cultivate it as its own private personal grooming pool for wives to be inducted into his plural wife order. So the fact that he organized it in the upper room of the red brick store is rather significant because this was the setting that he was using for the endowment also, or that he would be using for the endowment. And the only people who were allowed to go through the endowment or be sealed to loved ones were those who were living polygamously. And being able to dangle the carrot of eternal exaltation thanks to these ordinances was one of the prime ways Joseph Smith used to convince people. So all of this background is to give just a super tiny taste test of how the temple has been integrated into our LDS culture in the modern day. The fact is that our LDS ceremonies, from the washing and anointing all the way down to the initiatory, are inextricably woven in with Masonry, secret societies, and polygamy. We're not even going to get into the Adam God doctrine, but that's in there too. If you are interested in that, you can go research that yourself. In the post-Mormon context, the temple can be kind of a block for a lot of us because it's so intricate. All of the symbols and all of the rituals and things can have a lot of profound meaning for us in our current modern day lives. And discovering these rather messed up histories around the temple and the temple ordinances and the temple rituals can be rather disturbing. And even though it's disturbing, then we have this cognitive dissonance of well, why did I feel good there? And why did I seem to have these insightful or powerful experiences that helped me in my life if it was all just based on this gross plural wife stuff? As we're trying to process this, I think there are a few key things to remember. first is that the church spends $200 to $300 million on these buildings for a reason, and then millions every year to light them and landscape them and clean them and make them smell nice so that we have good aesthetic experiences there, so that we have good connections with that place. And then we sing songs from when we're, 2 to 3 years old on up, about how we love to see the temple and I'm going there someday. And so we're kind of indoctrinated on one side, and then they are a very aesthetically pleasing environment to be in. And when you get away from your busy, normal day, everyday life, and go into a beautiful place where you can just relax and you don't have any pressure to do anything, and you're not even allowed to keep track of the time there, that can be a rather restorative and peace-inducing experience. That's totally fine. It's totally normal. The other thing to remember is that ritual is highly symbolic, as is the processing in our brain. And so when we are dealing with symbols, our brains can use symbols wherever they're coming from in really interesting ways. And it doesn't mean that you are finding some cosmic truth to find something in the temple, but it could, and it's enjoyable regardless of whether it's a cosmic truth or not to find those connections. So even if you were finding, LDS-based connections between all of these different symbols and things and enjoying that, that's also still totally normal. That's a pleasurable activity for your brain. Also, these symbols are way older than Mormonism. That can help too. The last thing that I want to talk about with temples is the importance of ritual. One of the big reasons that the temple is so useful as a centerpiece for the LDS religion is because it gives us this nucleus of rituals to orient our lives around. Now, if you are an ex-Mormon or if you've been in a faith crisis for a long time, talking about rituals might be kind of triggering. I don't blame you. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that it is very useful and important for our minds and our psyches to connect with other people, to be able to recognize the milestones in our own story, and the prime way that we as humans have developed for doing that, for marking the events of our lives, for connecting with our community, for remembering our ancestors, for passing on knowledge or wisdom to the future generations, is through ritual. Thus, a lot of the power from the temple comes from the way that it has employed ritual. And just because it's copied those rituals from Masonry or from even other religions like the Native American religious traditions, doesn't mean that they are not effective. They're very effective for most LDS families in orienting their entire family religious practice around the temple, because you have the goal to go inside the temple as a youth to do baptisms for the dead, which keeps you in those bishopric interviews, which keeps you in the indoctrination cycle all through your youth years. Then once you get to be of missionary age, then you're encouraged to go through the temple for your endowment before you leave on a mission, which is incredibly culty, and we haven't even talked about the actual ceremony yet, but maybe we can do that tomorrow. Then as you are getting back from your mission and you're dating or going to college, then you're encouraged to get married in the temple. And all of these things are these important life transition points that the church has pulled into being about the temple. And the more of those important life transition points the church kind of claims for itself by using the temple as this nucleus for all of your life experiences, the firmer the hold of that organization is on that person's life. Because now it's not just as simple as saying like, oh, Joseph Smith was a jerk and a liar, and so I'm going to leave the church. It's your entire life. It's your entire identity that you're trying to disentangle yourself from. And that is a lot of work, and not many people are willing to do that. So if you're in the ex-Mormon communities, kudos to you, because you were courageous and willing to disentangle that, and it's hard. Anyway, as you're processing the temple, it can be helpful to learn the history. It can also be helpful to replace the ritual aspects of the temple with new rituals that are more supportive to your values. Because you don't have to lie to have a ritual. I follow this poetess on Facebook, and her stuff is so insightful, and it really resonates with the LDS experience too, even though she identifies as like a post-evangelical Christian. And then this morning she was talking about her growing up experience with the Church of Christ. Those of you in advanced level Mormon history might recognize that name. The Church of Christ was one of the Restorationist churches that was started in the 19th century by Alexander Campbell. Now, those of you of advanced Mormon history will recognize that name too. That's because Alexander Campbell was Sidney Rigdon's old preaching partner. In fact, a lot of Sidney Rigdon's ideas about theology came directly from Alexander Campbell, who was older and had a more established congregation and more or less trained Sidney Rigdon. Thus, the fact that a lot of those ideas have trickled into the LDS church is not surprising. This is one of those eureka moments where, I've learned enough about Mormon history to recognize the significance of this post that someone I've never met, someone who has apparently never interacted directly with Mormonism, is saying things, and I'm like, oh my goodness. This is from the same cultural milieu. It has the same fingerprint. It's like the same DNA. It's so weird and creepy and cool, and I don't know, all the things. I just want to read you a little bit of what her post says and just substitute out the names for names in LDS theology, and it's astonishing how similar it is. Okay, so she says, she's being sarcastic, by the way, so the wording is going to be a little bit funky, but she says, I could begin with the Restoration movement and old Barton Stone and Alexander Campbell. I could say that the Churches of Christ started as the Disciples of Christ and then broke off as its own thing because breaking off from people is the thing that the COC likes to do best. I could call attention to the moniker New Testament Christians and the fact that this denomination, which refuses to call itself such, claims to be the church established in 33 AD and denies any influence from any other denomination because they follow the Bible perfectly, unlike the heretical Catholics. I might say something like, the COC is distinctive for its doctrine around baptism, immersion only for 10 and up, give or take a few years of accountability, and priesthood of all believers model, unless the believers are women or queer, and then suck it, suckers. I might say all these things, but I won't because I don't want to deal with all the self-righteously angry COC Bible majors and the professors correcting me in the comments. Go read the rest of the post and the Wikipedia article on Alexander Campbell for more info, but what's important and stands out to me, this church started first, and Alexander Campbell was on the circuit through Palmyra. I was planning on doing all the temple stuff yesterday, but there was just too much, and I ended up spending the whole time on temple history. So today we're going to get into the practical aspects of the temple experience and processing that as a post-Mormon. When someone is just investigating the church for the first time, it all sounds pretty Christian and pretty benign because it's like, oh, it's about Jesus. This guy had a vision of Jesus, and we're just trying to be Christians, be patient, be kind, be loving, serve the poor and needy, blah, blah, blah. But once you get baptized and you're making this commitment to follow Christ, all of a sudden, all of these extra fine print stipulations come up on your life plan, and that it's not just about following Jesus anymore. It's actually about going to the temple. And it's not just about going to the temple once, it's about going to the temple over and over and over and over and over again so that you can redeem your entire ancestral line. Though I can see the brilliance of this as a strategic move, I also think it's completely unethical, dishonest, and incredibly damaging to the people involved with this system. Because how this plays out practically is that the Christian language, Christian symbolism, Christian ideas are used to stimulate the spiritual sensitivity or the emotional sensitivity of the person being courted or the investigator. And once that person commits to the system, then they are sucked into an extremely hierarchical, rigid, perfectionistic cult system. And the church struggles with this a lot, all the time, day to day, because members, as members, we are given the language of Christianity, the language of unity and of transcendence and of love and forgiveness, but we're given the practical instructions about living in judgment, in living in fear, in living in guilt, in living in shame. And we are taught to turn around and make other people feel guilty, ashamed, afraid, ostracized from the group too. For this reason, I've come to think of it that Mormonism is not Christian. However, a lot of Mormons are Christian. And there's a lot of friction for the Christian Mormons because they are trying to live Christian lives in an extremely oppressive, cult-minded system. Does the cult thinking still show up for those people? Absolutely. But I find that in the ex-Mormon community, one of the big surprises was that a lot of people were leaving because they were so Christian, they couldn't stay in this system. This conflict that we were talking about in the last video between the Christian language and the cult mechanics of the LDS church really come out in LDS temples. For most people who grow up in the church, this unchristianity, the cult mechanics go completely unnoticed until they get to the temple. Because as we're growing up in primary and young men's and young women's, there's a lot more of the Christian language to kind of candy coat the poison of the cult mind control. Candy coated poison is what Mindy Gledhill calls it in her song about her faith crisis, and I love that. I just love it. So vivid. So we end up singing songs like, oh, I love to see the temple, I'm going there someday. And then we sing like, oh, families can be together forever. Or obedience is the first law of heaven. Sacrifice opens the windows of heaven. We're singing all of these things like every week at church. And we're reciting the young women theme, which says like, my job is to go to the temple and make babies forever. And so most of us learn to ignore kind of the back alley chatter at church about like, oh, polygamy. Joseph Smith was a polygamist. Blood atonement. Brigham Young killed people. Mountain Meadows massacre. All of that stuff just goes completely unnoticed because we are so indoctrinated. We're so in love with the Christian doctrines that are being portrayed, and we're so motivated or so tied emotionally to those ideas that a lot of these red flags just don't even register for us. It's part of the water that we learn to swim in. However, once we go to the temple, the arm is laid bare about what the church is really about. The church wants you to shut up, sit down, be obedient, give us your money. And the language becomes distinctly less Christian in the temple. And even though Christ does kind of show up, he's really like a kind of a side to a side character. These are the reasons that I think the temple is fundamentally unchristian in the LDS church. It promotes the idea that works will save you, that we are in charge of redeeming the dead and of saving our ancestors. It enshrines this idea that perfection is required in order to enter heaven, that hierarchy is the law of the universe, that patriarchal violence, misogyny, and privilege are the example of perfection, and that Christ's love and service is not ultimately what matters about life. Most damning of all, though, pun intended, is that the LDS temples do not give you informed consent. And in the next video, we'll go into detail about how the LDS church is actually acting as their own character, Satan, when it comes to LDS temples. Okay, let's talk about Satan. I don't care if you had a different Satan in your movies, this guy was my Satan. And since I technically went through my temple endowments with him saying that I would be in his power if I broke those covenants, this seems appropriate. So the key features of Satan in the LDS temple film, I think, are really interesting and really compelling too, because they're pretty freaky. Like, Satan doesn't have to tell the truth. He can say whatever he wants, and usually he mingles the truth with a bunch of lies, or mingles just a little bit of lie with a bunch of truth. But he's not constrained by rules like God is, to be honest, so he can say whatever he wants in order to manipulate the situation to his advantage. Pretty freaky. He also gives Adam and Eve almost no information about what he is asking them to do. He comes and he tells them to eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And when they ask why, or when they start asking questions, he's really evasive and sketchy about answering them. He won't give them a really straight answer, but he's trying to give them answers that make them think he has more authority than he does. Then, once he's been found out, he kind of shows his true colors, shows his apron of the holy priesthood, or his imitation apron of the holy priesthood. And he's dressed in these fine robes, and Adam and Eve are naked. So he basically shames Adam and Eve to go into hiding. And then he blame shifts once God calls him out on all of his crap. And says, it wasn't my fault. You did this in other worlds. This was done in other worlds. It's not really clear what he means by that. This was done in other worlds, meaning there were other Satans who did it in other worlds, or God was doing it in other worlds, or what? Who knows? But he blame shifts when he's called out on his BS and tries to shift the blame back onto God, the honest person. And then when he can't get out of it, when God's not letting him weasel out of it, he reacts aggressively and he starts to threaten Eve, primarily, the woman. The astute listener and student of a faith crisis will not have any trouble at all seeing the parallels between how the church behaves and how Satan behaves in their temple film. But let me just fill in the rest of the picture for you. The church does not tell us, the members, the truth about itself. It doesn't answer straightforward questions. It takes a bunch of truth and then it mixes in some lies. In some parts of the history or the policy or doctrine, etc., it will mix in more lies, and sometimes there are less lies. But there's always this essential massaging of the truth, this contamination of the truth with lies. It also manipulates us and uses our emotions to get us to serve its own end. And when something goes wrong, they shift the blame back onto us and blame women. Now let's go on to the really juicy part of all of our temple experience, which is the moment that we realized we were in a cult. When did that magic moment happen for you? Was it while you were sitting naked under a sheet as people touched your genitals without your explicit permission? Was it when you were given a new name to replace your name? Was it when you were sitting in the temple and had to pantomime your own death in gruesome, bloody ways? Or was it while you had to cover your faith in a smothering cloth and chant with your hands above your head? I went through after 1990, so I didn't have to deal with the naked sheet thing. And I didn't have to deal with the pantomiming my own death. Or at least I thought I didn't. But I did have the smothering face veil and the chanting above my head. And there was a very distinct moment in which all of the stress of the coming to the temple had kind of built up enough that I was like, what the hell am I doing here? And I kept looking over at my dad and my mom who were escorting me through the temple. And I was like, these are secret combinations, right? This is a secret combination. I've read about this in the Book of Mormon. This is a no-no. I even asked them about it afterwards and they didn't have any good answers. They were just like, well, if you keep going, then you'll understand it more. So you know, right, that all of the temple signs and tokens and grips and stuff all started with masonry. They were probably even more direct copies than we know, but the temple ordinances weren't actually recorded officially until late in the 1880s, which was, after the pioneers had trekked across the plain. They had all of this trauma trying to set up and colonize the West. That was the first time that they wrote them down. So undoubtedly things had changed a little bit. So the fact that they're still so similar to the Masonic covenants still is just proof that they were copied from Masonry. Anyway, after about 100 years, the Masonic temples decided that it wasn't very good to have their members pantomiming their own deaths anymore, so they removed the penalties from their oaths. And a year or two later, I think it was just a year and a half later, the temple, oh, surprise, surprise, revelation, they're removing their penalties too. Or at least they kind of took them out because they insisted that nothing had really been changed. And all of the signs of the priesthood are actually in the positions that would have finished the slashing death motion of the penalties. Someone who went through the temple in 1987 said this about it. The penalties involved various pantomimes where I had to pass my thumb across my throat, chest, and bowels, indicating different types of suicide while chanting with the rest of the room. Rather than do so, I would suffer my life to be taken. And there was a short pause after life so that they could do the slashing motion. That all leads to this important question. There are a lot of things that we could talk about in relation to the temple, and as you study more Mormon history, like more and more of the temple starts to make sense, because I feel like the temple was just kind of the cesspool where all of the stuff that the church didn't want anyone else in the world to see, like it all went into the temple. And so a lot of the vestiges of like really hardcore 19th century Joseph Smith doctrine are found in the temple, which is why it feels so culty and so oppressive, and why they're selling their tokens and signs for 10% of your income and your entire life of service. Also, the more you study about the penalties and the signs and stuff in the temple, the more it makes sense why Brigham Young would have concluded that blood atonement was appropriate as a application of the atonement, Christ's atonement, like Christ's atonement became blood atonement in Brigham Young's mind, and the translator for that to happen was the penalties in the temple. It also makes sense of the extremely oppressive and rigid gender roles, and why the church cannot allow for transgender people, for homosexuals, for queers of any stripe, and also can't allow for feminism either, because once you have women and men on equal footing in the church, the whole temple falls apart, and the whole authority structure of the church falls apart with it. Then there are the weird, like, culty oaths of vengeance that used to be said, that swore that for 7 generations, Mormons would be teaching their kids and their grandkids and their great-grandkids all to avenge the blood of Joseph and Hiram on the United States of America. You know, this reminds me that when Mitt Romney was running for president and there was that poll that was taken, and like 25 to 30% of people said they would just never vote for a Mormon, you know, point blank. They didn't care what party he represented. They wouldn't vote for a Mormon. And I was so offended. I was like, what? We're so nice and we're so patriotic. Why would you not vote for us? I think it makes a lot more sense in the total context of Mormon history. Anyway, all of this stuff is useful, but the temple can still hold a really big sway in someone's mind, because the temple implants so many phobias, you know, by the Satan like looking at through the fourth wall and saying, you will be in my power if you fall away from these covenants. So we have a lot of phobias built up around the temple, and it can be hard to let go of those. To me, besides learning about the temple history, which does help a lot, the most important thing is like informed consent. You know, the church taught me that Satan was the one who mixed the truth with lies, and that God would always tell the truth. So if the LDS church lied, that means they're not working for God. And whether or not that is like a fair logical assumption, that works emotionally for me, because I'm like, yeah, I don't owe allegiance to anyone that lies to me like that. Before we finish talking about the temple, though, I want to talk about temple names, because I guess it was a surprise for a lot of people that their name was reused or like recycled in the temple. I happened to know that going into the temple. I didn't know that everyone was given the same name on the day of the temple. I just thought they had like a grab bag, and I don't know, they like picked them out or something. But it does make sense organizationally, I guess, to keep track of everybody's name that way. What always got to me about these names, though, is that they're only taken from like the Bible, and then recently they added in some names from church history, and I was like, that is such a, you know, that's such a homogenous set of names. And having, you know, I served this mission in Russia. I've learned several other languages. I absolutely love Polynesian languages and Polynesian names, and there are none of those in the temple. There are no Russian names. There are no Polynesian names. There are none of these beautiful, diverse names show up in the temple roster. And that always just bothered me. That was kind of like a light shelf item that, like, why would God call us all by these same like anglicized names? That doesn't make sense. So eventually I had to assume that it was some kind of symbol for like a new name that we'd be getting sometime in the future, and we just had to prove that we were willing to keep it secret or whatever. But you know, that was way down the road. I'm getting off track. What I wanted to talk about was that I'm Reddit famous. I just found this. I'm so tickled about it. And he's right that this my TikTok name is based on my temple name. And just in case you didn't know the story of Ada, like my husband apparently didn't, I want to tell you. So in the Book of Moses, Pearl of Great Price, right? They go through the generations of Adam, and then Joseph Smith is like scrambling for names. So he's making up names like Methuselah begat Lamech, and Lamech is a real jerk. He is one of the first polygamists that we meet in the book, and he takes 2 wives, one of whom is named Zillah and one is named Ada. He doesn't even call them by their names in this story, but after he kills someone, he figures he's got to let somebody in on the secret, so he says, "Hey, you wives of Lamech," and then he tells them that he killed a young man because he had taken a secret combination oath and he had to. Since polygamy was one of my main shelf items, I was beyond disappointed to find out that my new name in the most sacred place in the temple forever and all eternity was going to be the name of a polygamist wife of someone who was practicing secret combinations. But as I was making this TikTok channel, I was like, you know what? Ada's kind of kick ass because she and Zillah rebel against Lamech and they take him down. In fact, it says that Lamech had spoken secretly unto his wives and they rebelled against him and declared these things abroad and had not compassion. So I guess you could say that my goal here is very scriptural. Today I want to talk about the LDS priesthood. This is kind of a complicated issue, which we touched on in the Temple series, because there are all of these conflicting accounts about how it happened. And by that I mean that Joseph Smith changed the story later on, causing a lot of people to leave the church about what the priesthood was, who got it, and who had the higher priesthood versus the lower priesthood. I go into more detail on this in the Temple video, but I think for our purposes in the post-Mormon space, this can be a rather complicated and tricky subject because a lot of us have had priesthood blessings that were very meaningful to us at the time, if not miraculous. And I am one of those who did have miraculous prophetic priesthood blessings that drastically influenced my life course. And I think this is interesting too, because even though not everything that my priesthood blessings have said has come true, they have affected my life pretty much uniformly for the better. It's been a very positive influence in my life. And so when I'm deconstructing ideas about the priesthood, I have to separate the ideas about priesthood blessings from the priesthood hierarchy, because I've had a lot of really bad experiences with the priesthood hierarchy, priesthood authority structure of the church. But I've had a lot of good experiences with priesthood blessings and with the intuitive gifts that brings forth out of people to talk about priesthood blessings, to interpret priesthood blessings, stuff like that. Let's talk about patriarchal blessings, just as an example here. That in my patriarchal blessing, it says a lot of things, including the things that I now think are more or less nonsense, like that I am of the tribe of Ephraim from the tribes of Israel, or that I would really enjoy sharing the beautiful message of the restoration and the sacred grove, which I didn't. I never liked sharing that. I memorized it in Russian. I did share it with people, but I shared it because I felt like I had to, because I felt like I was required to, because Preach My Gospel told me to, because all of the weight of my charismatic mission leaders was behind sharing that restoration story and sharing the first vision with other people. But I did not like that. There have also been really beautiful parts of my patriarchal blessing too that have guided my life for the better. For example, there was this line that said that the bad can be eliminated and the good can be added upon. And to me, that's come into play a lot when I'm trying to change the way that I think about something, when I'm going through a deconstruction and a reconstruction. And I feel like that gave me permission to recreate my paradigm every time. Then there was a line that said that I should have questions and seek out answers, and that the Spirit would guide me, that God would lead me by the hand and answer my prayers. And that's come into play in my faith deconstruction in a weird paradoxical way too, because I felt like I could trust my own intuition there. So there are some really good things about priesthood blessings that I want to highlight. First, I couldn't find the actual picture that he used in his Mormon Stories interview, but I think it was Hiram Joe from the Diné or the Navajo tribe who gave a Mormon Stories a while ago about his experience in the church and then reinvestigating Navajo or Diné, which is the Navajo name for themselves, the Diné culture. So he was reinvestigating the Native American cultural history around Joseph Smith and discovered that one of the Native American customs, or the Diné customs, was to give blessings for members of the community to come around and give blessings to people with hands on their heads. I couldn't find the exact picture that he used, but I did find lots of other pictures of other cultures doing the same thing. including Catholics. So we know that this was kind of a way of interacting with members of your community. And whether Joseph Smith got that from Catholic religions, from his own family, from the Diné or other Native American cultures, I don't know that it matters. I think it's just a beautiful ritual and a beautiful symbol of a community or even an elder or someone coming to bless the life or transmit wisdom or offer up whatever gifts they have to offer to the rising generation, or to someone who is sick, or to someone who needs help or comfort in some other way. So now when I think about priesthood blessings, about things like baby blessings, blessings of comfort, blessings of healing, etc., I'm like, I don't see any reason that those can't work, that they can't be effective even outside of the framework of the church. People have been doing this in many different forms, in many different cultures, under many different auspices for thousands of years. And I think that having that community support or that engagement with other people is really meaningful and beautiful, and that who knows, maybe we are transmitting some part of our life force. Maybe we're interconnecting ourselves again by going through a ritual like that. But whatever it is, I think it can still be valuable even without the LDS Church to back it up. I also think that generally in a patriarchal structure, the roles of men and women are very relegated. And the roles of men, even though they do have a little bit more upward momentum available to them, they have really strict gender roles on how to express emotion, on how to engage with their intuitive gifts, etc. And the priesthood ends up being this really beautiful way for men to connect with their intuition and to transmit their wisdom to other people in the church. And I also think it's totally possible that some of those men have prophetic gifts. Let's talk more about these prophetic gifts. And just a caveat, this is kind of like the bleeding edge of my faith deconstruction, reconstruction. A lot of my vocabulary is still rooted in LDS theology, but a lot of my ideas have been informed by like Eastern Buddhist, Taoist, etc. philosophies. And the result has been that I do believe there is such a thing as prophetic intuitive gifts or insight. I don't believe that a political office automatically gives someone prophetic insight. And when I talk about prophecy or prophetic insight or prophetic gifts, I mean like either actually telling what's going to happen and having that come true, not just on a random like shot in the dark basis where someone gets one thing right once in their life, but on a relatively consistent basis. And then second, by prophetic gifts, I think that could also include things like what Brené Brown does, where she studies and observes patterns and is able to articulate the patterns of being or the patterns of behavior that will lead to certain outcomes. And I think that is a type of prophecy, is that you're able to observe things well enough and accept the way things are such that you can see the way things will become. Just a funny side note, while we were in our deconstruction, one of our family members actually told us that to be a prophet didn't mean to see the future. And I had such a time not laughing because I was like, that is literally the definition of prophet. But anyway, with all that in mind, it can then start to make some sense as to why there are definite differences in what kind of priesthood blessing you get in the LDS Church based on who gives it. Because some people, I think, are more connected to their intuition and are better at observing the circumstances, or are more connected with the cosmos. Who knows? I don't know why it happens, but I think some people are more connected to whatever that is, and so they are able to offer more prophetic counsel through their priesthood blessings than others. Apparently, none of the Q15 have this gift because all of their priesthood blessings end up killing people. However, that doesn't mean that no one in the church has those gifts, and in fact, I think that my father is one who does. Because in my priesthood blessings growing up, I got really used to the fact that if my dad said it in a priesthood blessing, it would happen. He prophesied that I would get into BYU, and so BYU was the only school I applied to. He gave me a template for how to recognize my husband, and I recognized him immediately. Like the first day that I met him, I knew I was going to marry him. And he's also prophesied other things about my life that have come true. More in the next video. So talking about gifts of prophecy or intuitive gifts might just sound a little woo-woo, a little hokey, a little like, I don't know, you're probably misinterpreting those life events, and that's okay. You know, you don't have to believe that these things happen. Like, this was my life. These were my experiences. I recognized them, and I had these experiences for me. I didn't have them for you. So I don't feel the need to convince you of this. You don't have to believe in prophetic gifts. And in fact, I think that if believing in prophetic gifts makes you vulnerable to charismatic leaders like splinter groups of FLDS who will try to tell you to practice polygamy based on their prophetic gifts, then absolutely don't believe in prophets. You know, just cut that out of your life. However, if you're like me, or if you had a rich spiritual background in the church or in whatever culture that you came from, and you're trying to make sense of your faith deconstruction and trying to make sense of why you would have had these experiences that seemed prophetic or seemed really spiritual, and yet now you're deconstructing the framework that you used at the time to understand those experiences, then I think this can be really helpful. It can be really helpful to remember that there's just a lot we don't understand about this stuff, and that there can be unexplained connections between people, between the present, the past, and the future, that we may have access to through intuition, that some people might have more access to through intuition than is normally available in the general population. And if you are one of those people who does find value in still finding some way of making room for these ideas in your current framework or your current paradigm, then I think it's also important to remember that whatever someone tells you based on their intuition is something that you should just hold loosely. If it sounds meaningful, if it sounds accurate to you, then test it out. You know, use the scientific method, use your rational processes. As we've talked about before, you know, you cannot just be a logical person without your emotions. Your logic depends on your emotions, and your emotions depend on your logic. You feel things differently based on how you understand them, and you understand things differently based on how you feel about them. So these two ideas are connected, and when you are interacting with someone, especially a charismatic leader who you should always be cautious of, if you're interacting with a charismatic leader and they start telling you things about what's going to happen in the future, use all your faculties to try and test what they're saying, to try and see the implications, and stay loose with your conclusions about that. Just because they say one thing will happen and it happens doesn't necessarily mean you should do whatever that person says. So basically, use your common sense. At the crux of deconstructing the priesthood and priesthood blessings, though, I think the history really helps you to dismantle why the priesthood authority structure doesn't have much merit. It has caused a lot of harm. It's protected a lot of abusers. It's promoted a lot of yes men and a lot of people who are not brave enough to take the church and change it in the ways that it needs to change. And it hasn't done the job that it promised all of us it was going to do. And by doing what it said it promised, I mean making a Zion community, creating the place where Christ would come back to earth in the second coming, stuff like that. However, when we are deconstructing the church, there is this temptation, there's this impulse, there's this urge to purge everything that informed or influenced our life as an LDS person. And that can include things like completely getting rid of things like baby blessings, of blessings for the sick, blessings of comfort, of community use of spiritual gifts or intuition, or even the acknowledgement of intuition at all. And I think that's kind of sad. Like that really cuts off like part of the fun of exploring the human experience to me. Because if you don't have room for some stuff that's like unknown, then you're limited in how you can believe other people's experiences. And my preferred mode of functioning, especially in this deconstruction and post-Mormon phase, is to just say like, I just want to believe people. I just want to believe people when they tell me their experiences. And maybe they're going to tell me the truth and maybe they're not, but I'm not going to base my life on whether they're telling the truth or not. I'm just going to let them tell me what they perceive to have happened. And if I approach everyone else with the assumption that I know or that I can explain everything that happened to them, I kind of lose a lot of what other people say. So I'd rather leave that door open and say that I'm going to use the scientific method. I'm going to use rationalism. I'm going to use my own experience to inform my decisions about the present. But that doesn't mean that I have to eliminate all possibility of anything else happening. I'm not going to tell someone that's had a vision of the Mother Virgin Mary that they didn't. I'm not going to have tell someone who practices Hinduism that those archetypes are not valid. Just because they're not the archetypes that resonate with me doesn't mean that they don't resonate with someone else. And I think there's room for that vast spectrum of the human experience, especially if we leave room for things like intuitive or prophetic gifts. Lastly, as we've talked about before, rituals are really important for marking the milestones in our lives, and the rituals of the priesthood can be really beautiful even if you don't frame them with the priesthood. Our discussion about the LDS priesthood and how to deconstruct the LDS priesthood as a post member wouldn't be complete unless we talked about family history, because a lot of us, especially if we have roots in the LDS church going back for several generations, have family history stories about people getting blessings or people meeting the prophet and receiving an apostolic blessing or stuff like that. That formed a very central core part of their decision-making process and about their worldview and about the way that they made decisions for their families, which ultimately affected us. And I think here too, it's really helpful to be able to leave the door open for intuitive experiences, for intuitive understanding, for some kind of interconnectedness between all people that can inform some of our decisions or some of our inner knowing about things. Because I think that the way that we talk about the spirit and about the priesthood in the LDS church makes it sound really absolute, like this is the word of God to you. And I think there's also room to say that like your intuitive gifts might be more locally informed. They might just be informed by your experience and your intuitive knowing of what will be best for you in that moment. So the fact that someone has a really spiritual experience with a priesthood blessing or with the spirit or with their intuition, in their conversion to the church and going to Utah and then getting married and having a family there, that can all be fine. Maybe their inner knowing really was saying like, this is the best path for you and this is the best way for you and your family to be healthy. Maybe we can make room for our ancestors to have been discerning like that. And I think that having the generosity to trust other people's intuition, like our ancestors too, if they decided to join the church or trek across the plains, or even if they decided to leave the church and then come back later, whatever it was, I think giving permission or having the generosity of spirit to trust other people's intuition is an essential part of our faith deconstruction, because it's an essential part of giving ourselves the generosity to change our minds, to use our intuition, to trust ourselves. There's this famous quote from the book Faust by Goethe that says, as soon as you learn to trust yourself, you will know how to live. And I think that's what ultimately this comes down to, is trusting yourself to know whether fitting something like ritualistic blessings or an understanding of intuitive or prophetic gifts will be valuable to you in the future. Giving yourself permission to change your mind about that. Maybe you need a break from it for like 3 to 5 to 10 years after you've deconstructed the LDS church because you've been so traumatized by your experiences there. That's okay too. Trust yourself to know what to do.